today I am also, back in my apartment, not at the Escarpment Labs offices. So, for those of you who were tuning in during the COVID era of Escarpment Labs webinars, this space probably looks a little familiar to you. So, welcome. Right. So today we're going to be talking about how to make non-alcoholic beers through fermentation. Definitely a topic that's exploded in interest in the last couple years, and it's an area that we've been really interested in, and trying to make sure that we're developing both knowledge resources and fermentation products that can help you make these beers. Whether you're interested in making non-alcoholic beers at your brewery, whether you're interested in figuring out how you can make non-alc or low-alc beers at home, and also if you're just interested in how non-alcoholic beers are made. There's a lot of, I think, mystique out there. I'm going to try to break it down and explain some of the common methods that are used. So just to give an overview, I'm going to talk about, why would we bother making non-alcoholic beers in the first place? I'm going to be talking about the basics of non-alcoholic beers because there's a few different ways that they can be made. I'm going to talk about sort of our area of expertise, fermented non-alcoholic beers, so using fermentation technology. We're going to talk about the food safety considerations. This is critically important. We're basically playing a whole different game with non-alcoholic beer. Alcohol absolves us of a lot of our sins with brewing when it comes to food safety risk. It's a lot higher risk with non-alcoholic beers, so we have to keep that in mind. And for that reason, we're also going to talk a little bit about pasteurization and some of the different methods of pasteurization, as well as some of the other hurdle effects you can introduce to reduce any safety risks with non-alcoholic beers. We are going to talk about homebrew considerations. There are some limitations there, but there's also some ways that you can make low or no alcohol beers at home safely. We are going to talk about our own yeast and probably drop some hints at some other stuff that's been tested as well. The non-alcoholic yeast, we're going to talk a little bit about that, as well as some recipe suggestions for you to take home and ponder. And all of this and more is based on our guide to making non-alcoholic beers through fermentation. That's a little guide that we put together this winter. You can go on our website, download that guide. Should give you a lot of information you can use. It also has a bunch of recipes at the end as well, because that's one of the first challenges with NA is like, where do I start, right? I'm making this like low gravity beer. It's weird. So we help break that down. Okay, so why would we make non-alcoholic beers? And there's a few factors that I'll dive into. So number one is it's actually a growing market. So on the commercial side, except for 2020, when people were drinking alcoholic beer en masse, the non-alcoholic beer market has been growing, and it's forecasted to continue to grow pretty aggressively. We're really in the growth years right now in terms of non-alcoholic beer globally. So it's certainly a growth opportunity both for brewers large and for small brewers, right? It's a way to reach a new market, offer a new product, and maybe even different or new distribution channels. So there's really an interesting opportunity here for people making beverages professionally. And to that point, it's expected to double, at least double in size in the next 10 years. So really, despite some of the challenges in beer and alcohol as a whole, non-alcoholic beer seems to have a pretty promising future. And here's an illustration of some of the challenges with beer. Alcohol consumption per capita in at least most of the Western world has not been going up. You do see a little bit, if you look at this graph, a little bit of growth in the US on that per capita basis, but this ends at 2014. I know that there is some more recent data out there that shows a decline in alcohol consumption, including the US, including Canada. So by and large, there's less alcohol being consumed. There's also more spirits and RTDs being consumed. So beer itself as a category has an uphill battle that it's got to fight. Craft beers, not immune to that either. So that is one of the challenges of the modern era is the fact that alcohol consumption is not going up. So we are, as brewers, we are competing for an increasingly small piece of the pie, especially in countries that have declining birth rates and population rates. So it's not going to get easier. And there's other reasons why make and why consume non-alcoholic beers. There are some legitimate benefits to these products. In addition to reducing alcohol consumption, which is a pretty clear trend in most countries, including Canada and the U.S. There's also, people are health conscious. They recognize that alcohol has calories, right? So switching to a non-alcoholic option reduces that caloric intake. It'll reduce your risk of a hangover. All of these things. So for a lot of these reasons, we're seeing consumers choose to consume non-alcoholic beers, and you see that growth in the marketplace in comparison to conventional beers, which are fairly stagnant. Some of these non-alcoholic beers and non-alcoholic brands are growing like wildfire. I know the last time I looked at the data, Athletic Brewing, which exclusively makes non-alcoholic beer, was the fastest growing brewery in the US. So that does speak volumes to the interest that the consumer has in these types of beers. Okay, so why are you interested in NA beer? And if you're here live, or if you're watching on YouTube, feel free to sign off in the comments, because it's always good to know why are people here. And I'm just going to also post some questions here to consider as well, because there's clearly an opportunity for brewers to get into making non-alcoholic beers. There's also certainly some challenges and to be aware of. So number one is, why are you making a non-alcoholic beer? I don't think that a convincing answer is because everyone else is, because eventually, if you don't have any kind of unique angle, then you're going to be outcompeted by someone else, right? One of the interesting opportunities and challenges with non-alcoholic beer is, because it can be sold kind of like a soft drink in a lot of jurisdictions, you can get to scale, you can get to distribution a lot faster than you often can with alcohol. But that also means that the people that have the money, that have the distribution, often have an advantage. So if you're a small brewery, 7 barrel, 10 hec, 20 hec, and you're looking to position your own non-alcoholic beer, you got to make sure that it makes sense for your own market. So you got to know who you're selling your non-alcoholic beer to. There's definitely a case for a brewery that's small, that's doing mostly, tap room and cans out the front door, to be producing non-alcoholic beer, especially if that focuses on the local market, the local community. And we certainly have seen some breweries be able to grow like crazy as well through distribution. Athletic in the US is the prime example, and we've seen a few breweries be able to add quite a lot of volume and growth through NA beer in Canada as well. I just want to warn you that the longer you wait, the harder it's going to get in terms of competition in the market. And then the other thing is, these are really hard to make. Like, non-alcoholic beer is like brewing on expert mode. You got to be prepared to dump a few batches of beer, because it's not the same as making regular alcoholic beer. A lot of the parameters are different, and that often means that you're going to be spending a lot of time in R&D to nail down your product and your process before you're going to market at any kind of scale. So you also have to ask yourself if this is the best use of your brewery's R&D time, right? If your brewery can spend its R&D time dialing in its flagship brands, increasing throughput, reducing cost, or adding a new flagship when you think the market will support it, you should also be considering that as well. So just really consider what is the best use of the R&D time available to your brewery, because that time is precious, right? You want to make sure that it has the most value possible. And for some breweries, that's going to mean developing non-alcoholic beer processes and brands. And for some, that might not make sense. So some of the other answers that I've heard are, brewers are looking for a new challenge, which is awesome, right? It's really cool to try this stuff and have it work. Because it is brewing on hard mode, when it does work, it's really, really rewarding, and does help brewers to tap into new markets, right? Especially if you start looking at that soft drink market, which often operates at higher margins than beer does. And then, of course, for those of us making beer, recognize that we're surrounded by alcohol all the time. We would love to have a option available to us that allows us to consume beer consciously, and a part of that equation is often having access to NA beer. So What better than to have an NA beer that you've made yourself or that your brewery's made? Keeping in mind some of the challenges with making it. So those are both totally relevant. So how do we define that before we really jump into things? Because even this is a little bit murky. The way that we're going to define it here is non-alcoholic beers or NA beers or non-alc beers, whatever your term is, are usually, depending on the jurisdiction, considered to contain less than 0.5% alcohol by volume. That does depend on the country you're in. There's some that are lower. So keep that in mind. By comparison, a beer that's labeled or called alcohol-free will contain zero alcohol, 0.0%. Usually they're labeled as such too. You'll see a beer saying like Heineken 00, Carlsberg 00, Budweiser 00. They're usually pretty clear about that. Most of the non-alcoholic beers made by smaller producers tend to be in that non-alcoholic category of there's some alcohol, but it is less than 0.5%. So just to keep in mind, because even the technology used to make these is a little bit different. So what are the technologies? I don't have the time to dive into the nitty-gritty of how evaporation works or how membrane works. We will dive in a little bit more into fermentation methods. But just to give a basic overview, there's two main ways you can make non-alcoholic beer. You can think of it as either removing alcohol through dealcoholization, or you can think of it as adding a minimal amount of alcohol through fermentation. Either way, you're achieving that net result of under 0.5% alcohol. With dealcoholization, there's two main methods. The first is evaporation. So this is actually one of the more old school methods. At its most basic, you can take beer, boil it off. Alcohol has a lower boiling point than the water, so eventually you can actually remove that alcohol by boiling it off. Doing that under vacuum at lower temperature helps preserve the flavors, some of the more delicate flavors in the beer. Even so, it's often considered to be a fairly crude method or kind of old school method for dealcoholization. So it is certainly common. And one of the other challenges with evaporation is the cost. You need the equipment, you need the vacuum still, and any other associated equipment in order to get up and running. And that can be hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars. Membranes are a common method as well for dealcoholization. So as opposed to a distillation, instead, this way you're separating molecules in your beer using a high pressure and a membrane. So using a method like reverse osmosis, which is often used to purify water, you can actually put beer through a certain type of reverse osmosis and remove the alcohol from the beer. Sometimes there's also like a little bit more nuance than that. Like maybe you have a few different outputs that are getting blended to match tastes and things like that. But the basic premise here is you're taking beer, you're putting it through a membrane, and you're separating out the alcohol, removing the alcohol, and ending up with a beer that is low alcohol. A lot of the actual membrane technology on the market, there's not a whole lot of technical information out there. So I would check out and see what's out there, but it's definitely a gap to be addressed by someone who knows more about this technology than I do, because it's also got a lot of promise. It's also quite expensive. I will say, just to be upfront, some of the best non-alcoholic beers that I've tasted have been produced through membrane, but it is not, I've also had really bad beers made with membrane technology. I've also had really good and really bad beers made with fermentation methods. So it often does come down to dialing in your individual method. Then we get into the fermentation methods, and that's where we're going to really focus on today. There's a few different categories, but really the name of the game here is restricting fermentation, so we're not going over that 0.5%, either through the strength of the wort, the starting sugar content, or through the limits of the yeast strain, or through things like temperature. So number one is limited fermentation with a maltose negative yeast, so a yeast that doesn't ferment maltose, which is the most abundant sugar in your beer wort. So you're going to get a low 10 to 25% attenuation. That's quite common. That's been going on, especially in Europe, for quite a long time. You also have limited fermentation with maltotriose negative yeast. So That's one of the next most abundant malt sugars is maltotriose. Regular beer yeast can consume it, but there's some strains that don't, and you can also select other strains that don't ferment maltotriose. Like it's fairly common with wine fermentation strains, for example, to not be able to ferment maltotriose. So you'll get a lower attenuation than a conventional yeast. There's also a method called arrested fermentation. So what that means is that you're taking a regular yeast and probably a low starting gravity wort. You're pitching the yeast, you're letting it ferment to a specific target, and then you're as fast as humanly possible, you're cooling that wort or removing the yeast before it keeps fermenting, or you can run it through a pasteurizer. I would say the best approach here would be to get that yeast out and then pasteurize that beer as fast as possible to avoid it from over fermenting. Because with arrested fermentation, that's the biggest risk in a brewery is it goes too far, and then now you have to make another batch or blend it, and there's a lot of rework that can happen. But it can be effective because you can use any strain. Cold contact fermentation is another method. It's really funny. You basically just wave the yeast at your wort and you call it beer. There's not really any fermentation here. It's really just pitching yeast into cold wort and achieving a small amount of alcohol or no alcohol, but likely transferring some of those beneficial yeast flavors into that non-alcoholic beer. So yeah, I couldn't come up with any memes for any of the other techniques, but arrested fermentation gets one here. Okay, so just to look at that sugar breakdown, because this is really the key to understanding fermented non-alcoholic beers and how to control them. Barley wort that we make for our beer fermentations is complex in terms of its sugar content. It has a number of different types of sugars in it. The folks making wine are pretty lucky because they just have like these top three: the glucose, fructose, and sucrose. For the most part, in beer fermentations, we have complex sugars. So we have maltose, a 2-chain sugar. We have maltotriose, 3-chain. We also have even larger sugars like maltotetrose, which 4-chain, or even larger sugars, which at that point we start calling dextrins and then starches as well. So the dextrins and starches are typically unfermentable by our brewing strains unless they are diastatic strains. For most brewing strains, we're going to fully consume the maltose and those simple sugars, the glucose, the fructose, and the sucrose, and typically have a variable consumption of the maltotriose and the maltotetrose, which gives us that variation in attenuation ranges between all of our ale and lager strains. So just to illustrate, this is what regular beer yeast does. It consumes most of those sugars, but it's variable on the maltotriose, which explains a lot of and the maltotetrose, which explains a lot of the variation in attenuations we see between different beer strains. That alone could be its own whole webinar. If we look at a maltotriose negative yeast, so classic example for those who started homebrewing 10 years ago, 12 years ago, like I did, is that dry Windsor strain. I believe it's maltotriose negative, so it's really low attenuation. So that's an example. You know, you're only going to get about 40 to 60% attenuation, depending on how the wort is made, right? Oftentimes for non-alcoholic beers, we're actually going to make wort to maximize the maltotriose and larger sugar content and make a less fermentable wort. So if we effectively control the breakdown of sugars in the wort, we can effectively control attenuation. That in itself is also a whole webinar. So as you can probably see, a lot of these topics with the non-alc beer is a bit of a technical rabbit hole that I hope we can go down in the future, because I think it's really interesting understanding everything that impacts wort fermentability. And then we get to our maltose negative yeast. So these are the ones that are easier to use in this process because they don't ferment maltose, and maltose is the most abundant sugar found in wort. So with these yeasts, you have a lot lower risk of over fermentation, of that fermentation going higher than 0.5% alcohol. So that makes these types of yeast quite beneficial for that application because they're only going to ferment simple sugars, glucose and fructose, as well as sucrose. Sucrose itself is just a glucose stuck to a fructose. Most yeasts have an enzyme called invertase that actually splits up that sucrose. into glucose and fructose anyway. So most yeasts found in fermentation are pretty good at fermenting these two sugars, whereas maltose, maltotriose consumption is more specialized. So what does that look like in terms of an actual fermentation? Here's an example where we made a wort with low starting gravity, so a low strength wort, but also with a fairly high mash temperature to make it more dextrin rich, richer in unfermentables. And comparing a maltose negative yeast in the blue, that's our nay, to a maltotriose negative yeast in the red. So that's a strain of Torulaspora delbrooki, which is a pretty interesting alternative yeast. And then also a Saccharomyces cerevisiae yeast as well that would have, what we would think would be the expected attenuation in that wort. So you can see those differences, right? With the maltose negative yeast, you're really just seeing a small drop in specific gravity, small sugar consumption. You're seeing a larger sugar consumption with that Torulaspora that can consume the maltose, and you're seeing the most consumption with that Saccharomyces cerevisiae that's going to be able to also consume some of the larger chain maltotriose. So that shows the difference, right? If we wanted to make a non-alcoholic beer with that Saccharomyces cerevisiae, we would have had to do our arrested fermentation at about day 1, right? Just to keep in mind. And same thing with the Torulaspora, like that would have gone too far. That beer would be a little bit high in alcohol. So you'd have to look at a different approach to making a fully non-alcoholic beer with that strain. Whereas the nay, no problem. So just comparing the methods, and I apologize for the wall of text here, but it's useful. Arrested fermentation is really beneficial because you can use any yeast, right? If you have a house yeast and you're just trying to make a non-alcoholic, version of your flagship beer, this is an easy way to get up and running because you can just use your house yeast in there. That being said, there's a lot of technical challenges. If you miss your arresting your fermentation, if you miss your cold crash or removal of yeast by a couple hours, that might mean that your beer is suddenly more than 0.5%, which means now you have to do a lot of rework to correct that beer. Also, because you're basically stopping the fermentation at the start, there's a pretty high risk of fermentation intermediates that includes acetaldehyde, DMS, diacetyl. Diacetyl you can solve through ALDC enzyme, very easy solution, but some of those others are still relevant. I've certainly tasted my fair share of arrested fermentation beers that are riddled with acetaldehyde and DMS, so that's something to certainly to watch out for, and also recognize that yeast health is critical no matter what you're fermenting with them. It includes non-alcoholic beer. If the yeast isn't fed right, you're going to get off flavors. Maltose negative yeast, the benefit is it's really easy. You can kind of just pitch the yeast and not have to worry that it's going to over ferment. The drawbacks are that typically these are not Saccharomyces yeast. There is now a one maltose negative Saccharomyces on the market. But historically, these are usually non-Saccharomyces yeast, which also means that they don't have the same domestication benefits of Saccharomyces. So, for example, low flocculation is pretty typical for a lot of these yeasts, whether it's some of the traditional options that have been used by the Europeans for a long time, or whether it's some of the new options on the market. We've tried our hardest to engineer and evolve nay to be flocculent, but it just doesn't behave. So that's a challenge. Maltotriose negative yeast. The benefit there is that you actually do have quite a large selection of maltotriose negative Saccharomyces yeasts, and their benefits, including domestication traits like flocculation and flavors, right? Less risk of phenols and things like that. There's lots of options. You can play around with wine yeast. You can play around with some sake yeasts are also maltotriose negative. And even some beer strains like that Windsor are also. So there's certainly some opportunities there. We're always checking now that non-alcoholic beer is growing, we're always checking our new strains that we isolate and bank to see how far do they attenuate, because now those low attenuators might actually be interesting to the market. But these yeasts are also at risk of over-fermenting or over-attenuating the wort, especially if the wort production is not tightly controlled, because If you are getting variability in the wort fermentability from batch to batch, you might have one beer at 0.3% alcohol and another beer at 1.3, and now you've got a bit of a problem on your hands. Cold contact, the benefits are it's really simple. The drawbacks are there's not really a lot of actual fermentation. It's just enough contact between the yeast and the wort to call the resulting product beer, which is important in some markets, believe it or not. But it doesn't do a whole lot in terms of actual fermentation or flavor production. However, some big breweries, making pretty nice non-alcoholic beer do use that method, so don't discount it. So what do we suggest in general? Here's another wall of text. I'm sorry. What do we suggest in general for fermented non-alcoholic beer production? In general, it's useful to use an enzyme to reduce the risk of diacetyl formation. ALDC is awesome. It works. It's cheap. On a per hectoliter basis or per liter basis. The time you save, even on regular beers like lagers, more than pays for adding the ALDC enzyme. It's kind of a no-brainer. If you're a pro brewer, we can help you source it. Super useful there. In general, you're making a low gravity wort with a high mash temperature to reduce the fermentability. I've got some suggestions on the right-hand side. For the maltotriose negative yeast, you want a lower starting gravity than a maltose negative yeast because you're going to get more fermentation. So you got to keep that in mind. That does limit what you can do, right? A lower starting gravity wort is also going to mean that it's going to be less malt character, thinner, all those risks, right? With the maltose negative yeast, you'll get a more limited fermentation. So you can do a higher gravity, meaning you can get more malt content and therefore malt flavor into the beer, and sometimes make something that's perceived as a little bit more substance and body. And then with the arrested ferment and the cold contact, it's kind of choose your own adventure, right? You're in control of the attenuation. So you do you. Some of these beers can be higher Plato. I have had non-alcoholic beers on the market that are a fair bit sweeter than what we've seen here. But in general, most are finishing below 5 Plato. Just because it's a low gravity wort doesn't mean that it's an easy fermentation. You need to use yeast nutrients with non-alcoholic beers. If anything, you need to use them more judiciously than with your regular beers because you're not using as much malt, and malt is the source of the nutrient for most, obviously for most beer fermentations. So if you're using a much lower amount of malt, you have to compensate with nutrients. I didn't mention this previous slide, but one of the other off-flavor major risks with non-alcoholic beers is sulfur production. And that's a result of the yeast not having enough nutrition, specifically not enough amino acids. So you have to make sure your yeast gets enough nutrition. And if anything, it needs more because you're making a mash that's going to not extract a lot of nutrition, right? Because you're going to do a high temperature, probably a single infusion, and you're not using as much malt, right? So there's a risk there. Highly recommend using nutrients, especially if you're getting sulfur in your non-alc beers. We do strongly encourage pasteurization. That's both for both for safety and also for flavor. I've been fortunate to taste a number of non-alcoholic beers made with different strains of yeast, including not just our own, before and after pasteurizing. And I know, at least for my own preference, I actually prefer the post-pasteurization non-alcoholic beers. One of the biggest flavor challenges in non-alcoholic beers is that they can be perceived as warty, like tasting like wort, like unfermented beer, which kind of makes sense because it is underfermented beer. A lot of those flavors that tell us this is warty are aldehydes, and some of those malt aldehydes are some of the most unstable flavor compounds. And so the pasteurization will degrade those flavor compounds and often reduce them and make a beer that's perceived as less aldehyde and therefore less warty. So even though you might lose a little bit of nuance from hops, for example, with pasteurization, you often do get a more balanced product after pasteurization, in addition to the safety benefits. And then also, because these are low strength worts across the board, It's recommended to build in malt character with specialty grains. It's not uncommon to see a recipe be like 100% Vienna or Munich. Any malt that has just a little bit more character, and certainly a malt that contributes body, and is also known for some dextrin content, can play here as well. Like if you're using straight Pilsner malt, you might end up with something quite thin and light. So it's important to keep that in mind. So when we get into the food safety, because it is really, really important, right? This is a totally different ballgame from regular beer, where we can kind of be cowboys about our safety practices in a lot of cases. Non-alc is quite different. It's a lot closer to normal food production. So we have to ensure food safety of these products. I would suggest one of the following. That could be flash pasteurization, tunnel pasteurization, sterile filtration, or acidification. I will say, of all of these, the most reliable would be the tunnel pasteurizer or the acidification. The risk with flash pasteurization is that if anything after that flash pasteurizer is contaminated, then there's a risk of that growing in your beer. And that can include regular yeast, right? Like if your beer is made with a maltose negative yeast, and your house yeast, floating around in the air, gets into your cans before they're filled, guess what? Those cans are going to blow up, right? So there's a physical risk. It's not just a risk of people getting sick here. Likewise with the sterile filtration, same exact issue. Yeah, the beer can be sterile, but are the lines in the cans after that sterile? That's a really relevant question here. Tunnel pasteurizing ensures that both the beer and the container are both pasteurized. So for that reason, it's a more reliable method. And acidification as well, just because acidification is one of the classic methods to preserve foods, especially foods that are not pasteurized. That's tried and true as well. There aren't a whole lot of organisms that'll get you sick, that are going to survive at low pHs. I said below 3.5 here. That's pretty aggressive. In general, you want to be below 4.5 and ideally below 4.2, but the more acid, the better is kind of the answer. And the other thing to keep in mind here with acidification is you still don't absolve yourself of the risk of yeast, right? You can have yeast get in and over ferment a package, certainly at least a packaged non-alc beer. For this reason, draft can be safer, but then you also have to consider how clean are the draft lines. Is there any risk of growth of anything unwanted in the draft lines? So for that reason, pH with draft service of non-alcoholic beers is very, very important, right? As is the cleaning of those draft lines. So I don't have any silver bullet solution here. It's just important to be diligent and make sure that you're following all of the food safety guidelines that you're required to. And just to talk about some of those hurdles, I alluded to this earlier. Our best solution against whether that's dangerous microbes in the sense of things that can get us sick, or whether that's just yeast getting into a maltose-rich non-alcoholic beer and making the cans explode, is introducing hurdles. The more hurdles, the more individual hurdles you introduce to prevent an unwanted microbe, a yeast or bacteria, from growing, the more successful that will be. And oftentimes with food safety, you see multiple hurdles used to make a product safe. So one we just talked about was acidity or pH. So in general, acidified products have a lower risk of harboring foodborne pathogens. That does not protect you against yeast. Some yeasts are incredibly pH tolerant. Alcohol is huge, and this is what we're up against with non-alcoholic beer. In regular beer, we have alcohol. That makes the product safe against the vast majority of anything that could hurt us. So we're super lucky with alcoholic beer production in the sense that we don't really have to worry about a lot of these things. When alcohol is removed or it's low, we have to worry about these things. Preservatives is a really interesting topic. I would love to hear from anyone who has a little bit more insight here, because I haven't seen a lot of information out there. there are some restrictions to preservative use in alcoholic beers. It does seem like there are some opportunities to utilize preservatives in non-alcoholic beers in jurisdictions where they're treated like soft drinks, where that's very, very common, right? If you're looking at like a Coca-Cola, it's got sodium benzoate in it. That's a preservative that stops it from growing anything bad, right? I think this is a really interesting opportunity. If you're in a place where you can use preservatives to stabilize a non-alcoholic beer, I think it's a great idea because it's oftentimes as effective or more effective than pasteurizing and can ensure that your product is safe. One thing to keep in mind is that a lot of the common preservatives are more active at acidic pHs, so that also highlights the importance of controlling pH and acidity. So things like potassium sorbate, sodium benzoate. Sodium benzoate especially pretty common in soft drink as a soft drink preservative, but keep in mind that it's going to be more effective at lower pH. So if you're trying to make like a super, super, soft, hazy NAIPA, you're probably barking up the wrong tree here. Also, that's an incredibly difficult challenge, and I wish you luck. Probably easier to make something else. There's other options too. So we have, there are some chitosan-based products on the market, which is a yeast inhibitor, which can work pretty well, especially for preventing re-fermentation. What we found is that some beer yeast strains are more resistant to chitosan than others. So that is something to keep in mind, is that there is some variation in terms of how sensitive different yeast strains are to the chitosan. So if you have that ultra specific question, you can always ask us. And then DMDC, dimethyl dicarbonate, is great. It's also known as Velcorin, is like the brand name. It's an awesome yeast inhibitor, but it does require specialized dosing equipment. So tends to be limited to larger facilities for that reason. And there's also salt, so maybe not as relevant here in beer, but I mean, if you want to make a non-alc goza, that's like this almost the safest non-alcoholic beer you could produce, because salt will also reduce the ability of unwanted organisms from growing. So, if you look at like pickle production, like fermented pickles, this is the hurdle they have, is they have salt. So they can stop the bad stuff from growing, and they can let the good lactobacillus grow and then acidify. So you're adding another hurdle against risk. So that's how some of our fermented foods like, kimchi, pickles, sauerkraut are intrinsically quite safe. So pasteurization, I'm not going to get into the nitty gritty, but really there's two methods. There's flash or tunnel. Flash basically means you have your beer in a pipe. It's going through some kind of heat exchanger, usually steam or hot water or oil, that is rapidly heating up your beer in line and then rapidly cooling it down in line as well. So basically achieving a pasteurization to a certain degree, all in an inline system, versus a tunnel where you're taking your packaged products, so you're like canning off your beer, and then it goes through this tunnel. The tunnel has a conveyor belt. It has a heating chamber where it's going to heat up your product for a certain time to target a certain degree of pasteurization, which these are always called pasteurization units, or PUs. And then it's also usually going to have a cooling tunnel as well, where it's going to cool that stuff back down. So it's not just like sitting hot and cooking. So kind of a controlled process. Key point here is that pasteurization is different for non-alcoholic beer than it is for alcoholic beer. This is based on some research that's been published, but in general, it does seem like beer with lower alcohol requires more pasteurization to achieve the same reduction in pathogenic organisms, as well as yeast spores, which can theoretically germinate and make your cans explode. And hops actually have an impact too. So lower IBUs tends to require more pasteurization. So those are two controls that you have to determine how much pasteurization to apply. I will say there's still enormous knowledge gaps here, especially on the craft, like small craft side. There are some pretty cool smaller scale pasteurizers, tunnel pasteurizers out there now, but not a huge amount of practical information on breweries using this equipment to make these kinds of beers and demonstrating the um, efficacy of the pasteurization they're applying. So I'm hoping some more research about that will surface soon, because I think it's really, really important to the industry, especially for small producers who are thinking about pasteurization, right? The last thing you want to do is be like absolutely cooking your beer with 200 PUs if you don't need to. Okay, so I've kind of been avoiding the home brewing topic. This has been a lot of pro brewer specific stuff. I do want to make sure that home brewers are included in the discussion. Although I will say up front, we do not recommend using maltose negative yeast in the home brewing environment due to the safety risks, right? Like if your pH meter isn't properly calibrated, then there's a risk of you getting bad stuff growing in your beer. If um, home brewing, it's pretty difficult to pasteurize. I have seen people do it in interesting ways. But in general, I think that there's some other ways that you can get low alcohol beers made at home that are safe and easier. So one option I would recommend is making non-alc sours. These are pretty much the easiest non-alc beers to make, in my opinion. You don't even have to use yeast. You can use a heterofermentative bacteria. So Lactobrevis is an example. Those will make a little bit of alcohol. We've seen it make up to about 0.4% on its own. And what that bacteria will do is, as it consumes those sugars, it'll produce a little bit of alcohol, but it'll also produce the acid. It'll produce the lactic acid and maybe some others. It's going to acidify your beer and ensure that the product is safe. So, and I've done this, and it can be quite delicious to make that low gravity wort, acidify it with lactic acid bacteria, cool it, carbonate, and serve it, and it can be quite delicious. And I would say this is probably the easiest way to make non-alcoholic beers at home or even commercially, assuming that you want to drink sours. Another great option is low alcohol IPAs. The reason I say IPA is because introducing the hops will also reduce the risk of contaminant organisms, right? So applying those hurdles. I would target not 0.5%. Like if you don't legally have to make the beer 0.5, I would, it's going to be easier for you if you target around 1 or 1.5% alcohol. That itself will also add more hurdle to reduce the risk of contamination. I would recommend making absolute certain that the beer is acidified below 4.2 pH. I would even go so far as to pre-acidify the wort to 4.5. Typically, especially if you're using a decent amount of brewing salts, which is pretty common for IPAs these days, a lot of calcium chloride and stuff like that. You actually can acidify this wort to 4.5, and it's probably not going to drop down below 4 because the yeast fermentation itself is going to be more limited, right? You might be making a wort that's like 10-16 for Plato to start. But again, you got to make sure that product's kept cold, make sure that pH is controlled, make sure any draft serving equipment is as clean as you can get it, because there are more risks than with regular beer. We do have a blog post with more information on this as well, if you're interested, because there's a recipe on there. And we've made it, and it's pretty tasty. That does bring us to Nay. So this is the first strain that we developed specifically for non-alcoholic beers. So you can see it's a pretty classic maltose negative yeast. It only has about 10 to 20% attenuation in a typical wort. It has a pretty standard temperature range, which we like, and pretty flexible flavor profile, I will say. Like some of the non-Saccharomyces maltose negative yeasts out there can be pretty crazy, and certainly we tasted our fair share. Like the process of finding Nay involves screening a bunch of the maltose negative yeasts, wild yeasts in our collection. A lot of these were coming from wild capture projects, because that's one way to source these kinds of yeasts. A lot of those were really disgusting, and it's hard to screen something that doesn't have crazy flavors, right? Because keep in mind that we're looking at non-Saccharomyces yeast, so how can we expect them to behave like a Saccharomyces? So in a lot of cases, you get some pretty wacky flavors. You might get an intense flavor, but you might not want your yeast to just smell like intense burnt rubber, and some of these do when you get into the non-Saccharomyces yeast. So This was a strain that popped out to us because it was fairly neutral and fairly flexible in terms of flavor profile. So we were pretty excited about that one because we thought, okay, this strain could actually work to make a non-alcoholic beer that lets some of the other ingredients shine. Where some of these non-Saccharomyces yeast can be really intense in terms of the flavor profile. Where do we get it from? It's actually a funny story. When we were first starting out at Escarpment Labs, we were working out of Wellington Brewery here in Guelph, and this was one fall. It must be fall. The brewer had a tote full of crab apples that he found somewhere for a project, and they started fermenting. So we did what we were supposed to do, and we took a sample and plated it out and took a look at what yeasts were in there. Did some sequence identification. So, okay, cool. There's this Hansenia spora uverum. Banked it and promptly forgot about it for 5 years in our cryo freezer. And then, this push to start developing non-alcoholic yeast came along, and we pulled it out of the freezer along with a bunch of other non-Saccharomyces yeast because we assumed, okay, non-Saccharomyces might mean low attenuation. And, lo and behold, this one was the one we came up with. At first, we probably will have some other options for non-alcoholic beers. The strain certainly does have limitations. If temperature gets too low, it tends to be quite slow to ferment or grow. It doesn't do a whole lot with the hops. We do get a little bit of floral flavor enhancement with hops, but the biotransformation is pretty low. And then another limitation is that it's pretty low flocculation strain. It also doesn't always respond to findings. We're still trying to understand better, what is the best findings to pair with this strain. And certainly if you have centrifugation or filtration, that's going to be your best bet with this one. So certainly some opportunities for improvement in the future. But I also think it's a cool yeast. It's fun to work with something that's not Saccharomyces. It's certainly presented some challenges for us. And even down to how the cells look is different, right? We grow it differently. These yeasts, this species Hansenia spora uverum, they form what's called apiculate cells. If you remember from the Brett webinar, I talked about the shape of the cells. Similar budding with the Hansenia spora, but the way that they bud off is they're almost like more extreme. They get this kind of like neck when they bud off. They end up looking like bowling pins to me. So I think that's really fun too. You look under the microscope and you just see a bunch of bowling pins floating around fermenting your beer. So I don't know. I think that's fun. To develop the strain, we did, in fact, compare it to some of the other options out there. So a really common strain, especially for European non-alcoholic beers, is a strain called Saccharomyces ludwigi. So we wanted to compare it to that. That's kind of industry standard for maltose negative yeast. There's now more options coming to the market, which is really exciting. But at the time, we wanted to compare it, and in this trial, we did prefer the NA over the Saccharomyces ludwigi. So that also to show that there are some differences between a lot of these maltose negative yeasts, and we do often find brewers will try out a number of different maltose negative strains before settling on their preferred strain. So where can you find it? If you're a pro brewery, you can order it directly from us. Right now, I'm doing the NA propagation, so it will be hand propagated by me. That might change in the future. If you're a home brewer, sorry, we can't do it. Just because we don't want anyone to accidentally get themselves sick. With the pro breweries, we have a lot more control over where the product goes and how it's used. With homebrew, we lose a lot of that ability to control the safety of the product. So for that reason, we're avoiding it. Although I do encourage you to try some of the suggestions that I made. I know it's not going to stop you from asking us, but we can't offer the name in the homebrew format, unfortunately. If you want to learn more, a lot of the content of this talk was based on our guide to making non-alcoholic beers through fermentation, which we put together in response to there being a huge number of questions from the industry about how the heck these beers work, and recognizing that there wasn't a whole lot of information out there available. So we tried our best to put together what we knew, and learn some things in the process. give you a general overview. We're always happy to answer any questions as well. We do see a lot of growth potential in the non-alcoholic beer market, and I think it's important to support that and answer any questions, and help you get off and running with this, because as I said, this is hard mode brewing. It's really difficult. There's a lot to think about. We can even do whole talks, spinning out from this on how to control wort fermentability, the quirks of Nonsaccharomyces yeast, all these things. So there's lots to consider. But hopefully you check out the guide, and that's a good starting off point. And you can also check out our knowledge base for general fermentation information, including some information on controlled fermentability. And we have 2 more webinars in this series. So I'm going to be talking about beer off flavors in 2 weeks. So you've probably seen a preview of some of this coming out on our blog from my partner, Nate Ferguson. I'm going to put a slight spin on that with our webinar, and I'm going to cover some of the more esoteric off flavors as well, including things like autolysis, THP, some of the sort of weirder off flavors, or Captain, all these things. And then we're also going to be capping this series off with talking about using beer yeast in cider, seltzer, sake, wine, and mead. If you have any ideas for any future webinars or any topics you want to see us talk about, you can always send over a comment, send over a question, either live in the webinar or on YouTube. We do use your suggestions as direction for the future. And there is a tentative plan for some follow-up webinars after this series. We'll probably have a small break and then keep going with some more topics. I don't think we're running out of things to talk about. So as long as you guys are going to show up and watch these videos, we're going to keep making them. So I really appreciate having an audience as well. And thank you for making it through to the end. And that leaves us time for the Q&A. So for those of you who are watching live, as always, you can tap the little box with the question mark in it on the right-hand side and type in a question. And I'll do my best to wait patiently and answer them. While we're waiting for that, I'm also going to just check the check the comments to see if there's any questions in there, and I do see one. So I'm going to start answering some of your Q&A. If you're watching this on YouTube, you can also just ask a question in the comment box down below, and we'll do our best to answer it after the fact as well. No problem. So Caleb asks, when we're talking about cold contact fermentation, are we looking at 0 to 3 Celsius? How cold are we talking? Yes, is the answer, I guess. I would also love for someone to fully explain cold contact fermentation to me. I have asked some people that either do it or have talked about it, and my question has been is there actually any fermentation happening? And I haven't really been able to get a clear answer. It suggests to me that maybe no one's really checked. But in general, you're either getting a very limited fermentation or no fermentation. And, I guess I'm sure someone out there is going to disagree with me, but I guess what you're doing is you're actually just flavoring the wort with the yeast, which honestly could be an effective way to make it taste a little bit more beer-like, right? So to each his own. Again, I have had some beers made with cold contact as part of the process, and they can be quite good. Eric asks, how about a sourdough webinar? Maybe. We do have some instructions on our YouTube for how to make sourdough bread. We could do it live, maybe. I'll keep that one in mind. Sourdough masterclass. I believe we are restocking our sourdough starter imminently. If you are interested in picking that up for your fall baking, we should have some in stock. Any other questions? I'll stick around a couple minutes, see if any questions come in, and then we'll wrap this up. Eric's already got the sourdough. That's awesome. I hope it's working great for you. I have to admit that I've gotten a lot lazier with my sourdough ever since we've had that product, because now I know I have a backup plan in case my sourdough dies or goes sideways. I can just go to work and grab one. It's very reassuring. All right, no other questions. So I think what we're going to do is we're going to wrap this up. If you do have any follow-up questions or you're watching on YouTube, you can always ask a question there or send us an email. Happy to help. And with that, I will see you not next week. We're going to take a break for the short week next week, and then we'll be back on September 11th to talk about off flavors. See you there.